Hello, everybody. This is Rich Peterson. I'm a relationship manager here at Allen Interactions. Today, we're rebroadcasting a webinar that we had done a while back called 10 Practical Principles for Creating Impactful E-Learning. Ethan Edwards will take you through this 1-hour webinar. So with no further ado, we'll get started here. If during the webinar, however, that you have a question during the live broadcast, I am handling the back end chat feature. So find your chat button at the bottom on the control panel, and you can chat with me during that. Please choose the all panelists and attendees. That way other attendees will be able to see your questions as well. Today, we're also broadcasting this live on YouTube. So if there's anybody watching from YouTube today, there is a chat function in there, which I am also handling. So again, I will start this webinar. Thank you very much.
truth be told, e-learning isn't that great for delivering lots and lots of content. People don't read very well online, and most of the ways that content is delivered is either through a lot of text or through somebody talking. And that really misses the boat on the interactivity, getting the learner engaged. And so instead of thinking about content being what you're doing, e-learning should focus on changing performance. That should always be the goal. And even when SMEs come to you with, people need to know this, you need to push back and say, well, what do they need to do? And that will be the guiding principle that directs your design. Another idea that I think gets us on the wrong path is that interactions are mainly and say, well, what do they need? In an awful lot of e-learning that I see, there's just test questions. Now, people don't learn by being tested. You learn by doing things, by making mistakes, by exploring, and tests are particularly poor at creating an environment for experimentation. And so what I really would like you to think about is that interactions are really about encouraging thinking. If you don't create interactions, e-learning is pretty much a passive activity, and people go through it sort of brain dead, hitting the next button without processing much. So your goal in designing interactions should be to create the maximum e-learning potential for powerful activity. And then the third principle that I'd like to debunk a little bit is that e-learning should be uniform. I think we get this too much from the idea that people are doing compliance training or certification training where somehow the outcome has to be uniform. And so we think, well, the training has to be uniform. Well, the thing is, every learner needs something a little bit different. And even when you're looking for the same outcome, you have to create some adaptability for individual differences to achieve those outcomes. And so instead of thinking about uniformity, I'd like you to think about how can e-learning create individual experiences. That's the great potential of e-learning, is that you're not limited like a classroom environment for everybody having to have the exact same experience. So as we go through this, and a lot of these counter ideas are what fuel the 10 practical principles. They are trying to achieve getting people to perform differently, to really maximize thinking, and how can we adapt our training to create individual experiences to take that advantage of that great strength of e-learning. Okay. I hope that these resonate with you and will empower you to sort of think a little bit differently and not accept as given some of these traditions that really aren't founded in good training. Okay, so that's the first foundational principle here. The second thing I want to cover real briefly is this idea of content-centric versus learner-centric design. It's sort of in the same deal as that we sort of have blindly accepted content-centric training as what e-learning has to be. And by that we mean we have content, and on this image it's symbolized by this book. And we want to hammer that into the learner's mind. And it's usually done by a push sort of mentality. Is here's the content, I'm just going to keep presenting it and accept that the learner's going to accept it, sort of like an open bucket, that if you're just pouring content in. We know that learning does not work that way. It's been known for many, many years, and yet e-learning designers continue to pretend like that's going to succeed. What we need to do is the reverse, which is, in its most simple sense, it is what we call learner-centered design. And instead of the focus being on the book, it's on the learner. And it's thinking about motivation, it's about thinking about meaning, it's thinking about engaging the learner's mind actively in experimenting and processing information. And so it becomes much more of a pull mentality, is you have the content and your job as a designer is to create an experience where the learner actively processes and engages with that content. It's a simple change in the diagram, you know, they're just mere images of each other. But if you really take this idea to heart, the change that it makes in the learning is incredible. And that is, you know, all the time think about what does the learner need to do? How are they motivated? How are they going to be engaged in working actively to learn? So again, that's another really important foundation idea that justifies these 10 practical principles. Okay, with those things out of the way, we're ready to jump into our principles. And what I'm going to do is I've got these little icons, and if you get the ebook that you'll be able to download, these are just symbols to sort of link these ideas. We're going to go through each of those. We're going to talk a bit about the underlying principle, and then suggest what you should do to improve things in each of these areas. So the first one, and with each I sort of hope to get your thinking going by asking you a leading question. And the first question I'm going to ask is, what's the first thing learners encounter in most e-learning modules? And so I just want you to think about that for a minute. You know, and for me, when I think about a lot of e-learning modules, first you get a title page of some sort. And then very often, the very next thing is a page of formal learning objectives. You know, it'll say, in this lesson, the learner will, and it'll be a very formal, detailed, accurate presentation of the objectives. The problem with that is hardly anybody reads them. And if you do read them, they sort of don't make sense unless you already know what they're talking about. And so it's a big flaw to start a learning environment with a meaningless activity. It sort of sets the stage for the learner to say, I'm not going to get anything out of this, and so let's just check out. And so our first practical principle is just don't list those formal learning objectives. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying don't communicate objectives. I'm just saying that this standard way of taking your learning objectives that you wrote and you need to write for your job as a designer and just somehow putting them on the screen and thinking they're going to make a difference is not very well founded. What we want you to do instead, or what I've learned really works, is you do need to communicate, but you need to communicate in terms and ideas that the learner understands. You need to tell the WIFM, what's in it for me, use conversational language, use pictures. This is a great place to use media. I mean, having a video that sort of illustrates a problem and then say, you know, this lesson's going to help you deal with these situations. But you want to highlight the problem in a way that arouses curiosity rather than stifling thinking, which typically formal learning objectives shut down the brain rather than activate it. As an example of what I mean by this, these are just some screenshots from a program we did that taught bus drivers principles of securing wheelchairs for passengers. You can imagine the content was very detail-oriented, and the content they had from the classroom instruction that already existed was very word-bound, and it talked about, you know, very logically the steps and the risks, but it left you quite unattached to and unconcerned about this content. Instead, what they did in this e-learning is they started with this sort of visual slideshow impactful news presentation sort of thing, and it was going through a case study where a passenger who was in a wheelchair, he ended up getting injured because a guy didn't secure him correctly and they loaded the chair on a hill. It talks about these mistakes, and he ended up causing severe damage to this passenger and it was fined millions of dollars. Now, that's the kind of thing that if I'm a driver and I'm realizing, gosh, I could be causing this kind of damage, I could be at risk for this kind of damages, I'm going to pay attention. You know, so think about how you can grab the learner's attention in a real meaningful way. Okay, that's our first practical principle. Just don't think that listing those objectives in that sort of formal way makes much difference. Think about how you can communicate those in a way that actually reaches the learner. Okay, our second practical principle, our question is, who are all the people who can be responsible for choices that are made while a learner is an e-learning module? That is, at the time that training is taking place, who is making cognitive, meaningful decisions? In a classroom, it often is the instructor who has a good sense of where the class needs to go. when a learner is working independently at an e-learning, the learner is the only person who can be making choices. And if the choices the learner is making are not really choices at all, like hitting next, that are meaningless, there's not going to be much meaning or direction happening. And so the second practical principle is let the learner take control. I know this seems uncomfortable to some of you in highly regulated industries, but if the learner isn't in control, no one is. And training cannot happen in a system without any intention and without any meaningful decision-making being made. So the learner should not be in the role of a passive victim. And I think an awful lot of students feel that way. The e-learning is being imposed upon them. Instead, they need to be the driver. They need to be the person who is at the wheel, so to speak, making those choices. So if you can let the learner choose the strategy, even choosing the sequence, or if there's different activities, how much help they want, all those things are the learner is going to be able to do better than you will. And so it takes a little bit of trust to turn that over, but it will make all the difference in the world in terms of having the learning be a meaningful activity. This is an example that you probably have seen if you've seen any other of my webinars, because it's just such a great example and it illustrates so much. But what happens here, this is a example that's teaching people to improve their supervisory skills. And again, there's a lot of content. This is an example about the rules that this company has about assessing risks in the workplace. And there's quite a bit of text, but instead of jumping in and just saying, I'm going to tell you this because you need to know it, this increases learner control and says, here's a situation. You're looking at this office, there's people that are making comments. This is not an interactive version of it right now, but you could look at it on our website, but it lets you roll over people and then choose what you're going to do. But this is what I mean by control. If I'm a sort of learner that likes to explore, I could just jump in and do it. If I'm a learner who really wants to have the rules laid out, I can come up to this link and it will tell me everything I need to do. But again, it's my choice. And putting the learner in control elevates the entire learning experience to a level that actually has a great deal of impact in most cases. Okay, so that's our second practical principle, is turn control over to the learner anytime you can. I can't say that strongly enough because that probably is the most important thing you can do to make e-learning come alive. Okay, another question I'm going to ask you is, what part of a lesson probably deals with the most complicated and most interesting pieces of the content you're trying to teach, the beginning or the end? Okay, well, I hope that you all are coming to the idea that the end is really where the meat of the lesson typically happens. The beginning pieces are sometimes the rudimentary content or the foundational information that's leading up to something. Well, the problem with most development schedules is we start at the beginning and just work straight through. And by the time we get to the end, that's when we're probably under the most time pressure. We don't have the resources or the creativity left to pay the right sort of attention to those vital parts of the lesson. And oftentimes, if we haven't figured it out, we get to the wrong spot. We start writing content and it leads us down a trail that may not end up being the most useful. So this practical principle is design the end of your lesson first. Don't always start on page one. What you want to do is, and again, when you get out of the content-centered approach, you actually don't know where to start unless you figure out where do you want the learner to be. And in a learner-centric approach, you're really thinking, what do I want the learner to do when they finish this lesson? That's a natural lead-in to what should you design first. What would be an interactive experience that you would want to create that would represent that end product? So what we want you to do is use your most productive design effort on the part of the lesson that matters the most. I know this is a radical statement, and I'm a big proponent of being very careful about your writing. But honestly, no e-learning is going to be made great simply by wordsmithing. You can improve a little bit by being a little clearer in the way you write, but the basic problem in most e-learning is not the writing, but just the fact that you're asking to have so much reading. And so instead of worrying about that stuff that has sort of a marginal impact, think about what is your final interaction. And then once you have that designed, your task of filling in the pieces that come first is going to be quite easy. Okay, on to the next principle. Oh, here's an illustration of that. And again, it's not interactive, but it's an example you probably have seen. This is an example that teaches safety officers how, as first responders to an accident, what they need to do in case, in this case, there was a bomb that exploded in a school bus. You can see it down on the screen. Again, they had quite a bit of rules, but instead of just starting with this guidebook, they designed this end exercise first, which is we got to get somebody in an environment where they're responding to a crisis. And then it created these gestures. And then they were able to back up and actually create a much more simple, straightforward lead in than they would have otherwise. So you can think about what could this final exercise be that really captures the intended outcome. Okay, here's another question for you. In general, are learners diligent in reading e-learning content screens carefully and completely? Now, this is one I can hardly read with a straight face because it's so absurd. Of course, we know that people hardly read anything online, and the statistics are really alarming. It's like, there's a range, but a lot of the studies have said that like 70 or even as much as 80% of the text in e-learning is not actually read by any given learner. People read the first few words and they skip on. So what that tells and if they need more information, if they want to read more, let them choose to it. Like in that supervisor effectiveness piece, there was a link that the learner could choose to say, I need to know more about this. And even though you're telling the same thing, you're going to end up with, yes.
Can you just repeat what you, starting this principle, because there was a cutout in the audio.
Oh, okay.
Just on this slide. No, back with the slide you were on. You went over this question. That was fine, and then just repeat.
So, like where the principle is. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Of course, Zebra doesn't let me erase this, but okay. So I'll start right now.
Yes.
Okay, so what we need to do is just talk less and do more. Let the learner do more activity. By talking less, I don't mean just narration. I mean the number of words you put on the screen, because people, again, don't read it very well. So what you want to do instead is let each learner decide for themselves when to read. You're going to have to use content delivery, but let the learner say, I'm ready to read this. You'll see a lot of buttons on many of our examples. It's a resources button or tell me more, and that really is how this principle is implemented. Focus learners on a scenario, on a challenge, and then have a very clear way that they can seek to get information to help them solve that. Okay, another question for you. Does what you physically do impact memory? That is, do you remember things that you have done physical activity with? And I hope that you immediately are saying yes, because this is a pretty well-established bit of learning as well. And so what that means is get the learner doing something. Clicking next or clicking buttons like labeled A, B, C, or D don't feel like anything, and they don't create memories. What you want to do is try through your design, create the idea of someone doing something in a meaningful environment. So when learners complete activities that suggest real life behavior, they're often more likely to remember and apply them on the job. So talking about something is very different and less meaningful than doing something. And so that's probably where your creativity as a designer can have the biggest impact, is how you can create a feeling of action when someone's going through an e-learning piece. Now I want to take a break for a moment and show you an actual example that I think illustrates these 5 principles. Remember what they were, don't show the objectives in a formal way, but communicate informally what people are going to expect and why this is important. Put the learner in control. I can't show you this, but the idea of designing your end interaction first, and this lesson came about in that way, and you'll see that we get in pretty quickly to an interesting activity. Don't talk so much. There's relatively little content delivery and a lot of action. And again, that action feels like you're actually doing something in the world. So this is written for Dairy Queen, and they were introducing these new sandwiches, and they needed to make sure they had a particular way that they were assembled, and they would, in the early morning, their employees would pre-assemble these things ready to go to put the hot sandwich in. And so this is a lesson to teach people how to do that. So it starts, again, not with formal objectives, but with a conversation. Good morning. At the start of each day, we pre-build our sandwiches to support fast customer service. So it's talking about what is the outcome we want. It's fast customer service, and it's your job to pre-build these sandwiches. Go through each step in the lesson, find the correct ingredients, pre-build the sandwich, and store it in the cooler. So we know exactly what we're going to be doing. So it's preparing us for this lesson. So it's time to build the turkey BLT. And are you ready? Yep, we're going to continue here. So it turns out we are immediately put into the environment where we're going to build it. These are the various ingredients that are at our assembly station. And our first step is to choose the ingredients. And to make the turkey BLT, gather all the ingredients together first. So I need to put them here in the workstation. I think I'm going to put mayonnaise on there first. And that isn't correct. We don't need to do mayonnaise in the pre-build. Well, maybe some tomatoes. Now, if I'm a learner and sort of seeing that I don't get this, I can go to the hint, and this provides everything I need to know. This is their job aid for creating these sandwiches, and over here is what you do to pre-build. So again, I'm in control of, do I want to study this very carefully, or do I want to go and just keep trying to figure this out? Either way, I'm being held accountable to get this right. Well, I think I know that this is on a ciabatta bread, and there's turkey and cheese. I think it's Swiss, American, or mozzarella. I think it's Swiss cheese and the bacon, and these are the things I'm going to pre-assemble. And sure enough, there I did get it right, and now I'm ready to pre-build the sandwich. Now notice that as I'm doing this, this is not some literally accurate simulation. I'm not having to unfold turkey, but it's enough that I do feel like I'm doing a real task. And so I need to do this in sequence now. And so first I need to get the bread out there. And then I think I put the turkey on next. No, the turkey's not next. Maybe the cheese goes right next to the bread. Yeah, that's right. And now I need to figure out how would I put it, half on the crown, one slice on the heel, or both. I think I put it on both pieces of bread. Check. Yeah. So anyway, I don't need to go through this too much more. You get an idea. It continues through. I have to put all my ingredients on. But notice that even though every step along the way is simply a multiple choice question, it really feels like I'm making choices to create this sandwich. So I've got everything ready now. I need to store it, and it's going to ask me, where do I put this? Do I put it in the ice box? Do I? But actually, how do I put them together? Do I store them separately, or do I put them together? I think I combine them as one. And now I need to decide: am I going to put it in the cooler? If I put them in the warmer, that wasn't right, so I guess I need to put them in the cooler. No. Oh, you know what? I have to keep them in this little tub. That's right. I remember. That's the right way. Correct. Use a covered Cambro pan. So at any rate, that continues through. I have to do that without errors, and I can do it on the different sandwiches. And it really does present the content, but it's learner-centric in the way that it engages a learner in letting each individual learner go through that in the way that makes most sense to them. Okay, so that's a full example that I think illustrates the power of these principles. And note that it doesn't mean that you have to be complicated. That's a pretty simple structured lesson. It really is just a series of multiple choice questions, but the way the learner is put in control and the way that the backgrounds are visual create a very different learning experience. We're going to look at a different example later that's somewhat more complicated, but I wanted to make sure you saw that in a very simple lesson, you could still reap the benefit of these practical principles for designing better e-learning. Okay, so there we're halfway through. I'm going to jump on to our next principles. I ask you a question: which do you think has more significance, an action that can be done thoughtlessly or an action that requires focus and attention? Again, now these questions are getting a little bit ludicrous, but I wanted to ask them just because it's important to realize that sometimes we take things for granted that don't make any sense at all. Of course, you want people to be making thoughtful, intentional actions. And yet an awful lot of e-learning interactivity is based on the learner doing things on autopilot. And how often you can get through a lesson just as quickly, thinking or not thinking, is a big sign that something's wrong. So the principle is you want to design specific gestures, things that are meaningful and not able to be done thoughtlessly. And some of those things we have to do, but I think the next button is probably the biggest candidate for creating thoughtless progress. Because you see it all the time is people just park their cursor over the next button, and then they maybe have e-learning or email up in a different window, and they just sit there and click that next button after the certain interval goes or the narration stops. And that means they're not thinking. So what you want to do is avoid generic interaction responses such as next, A, B, C, and so forth. You want to create responses that are integrated into the task at hand. And this is a big violation, I think, of a mistaken principle that people often have, which is saying you can't, for user ease, you need to put the buttons exactly in the same spot and never vary. Well, that's true for navigation tasks. It isn't that true for interactions, because interactions, you want to create thinking. You want to make sure that people are really problem solving rather than pattern matching. So I don't mean to make things different for no reason, but to think about how you can use specific gestures that require thought. Here are two contrasting approaches to building essentially the exact same question. This is taken from some training we did for a bank that was teaching tellers what are the 6 requirements of negotiability. And obviously the question you want to ask is somehow making sure the learner can identify all 6. So an idea, and it's not a bad idea, was let's present a check and then say this isn't negotiable, what thing is missing? And it's a multiple choice question, and it could be built out this way, and just list A, B, C, D, E, F with 6 possible things, and you have to look at the check and see which one's missing. The thing is, you would have a series of these questions, and you could just sort of generically click A, B, C, or D, which has nothing at all to do with being a good teller. If we look at the example on the right, which is sort of a redesign of this basic question, the question still is, this check is not negotiable, but I have to click on the check to indicate the part of the check that is making it non-negotiable. And this is exactly the task the learner needs to do when they're on the job, which is look carefully at checks. They don't have to click A, B, C, or D. They have to really examine the check. And so that embeds a very specific gesture, which is clicking on the instrument. And it makes this a more meaningful and long-term memorable activity. So think about how you can avoid in the interactions themselves sort of generic responses versus specific gestures. Okay, moving on, another question. Are learners more motivated in a harsh judgmental setting or a helpful supportive setting? Well, this may differ on the sort of school experience you've had, because there certainly are theories of instruction that are sort of debunked now that are very high pressure and punitive, because learners learn more in a supportive session where they are not being judged all the time. And so the next two principles sort of deal with this. And the first idea is try to avoid an adversarial tone. So often, e-learning is written sort of in a punitive way, that the learner is the enemy, and that the feedback is, no, you're wrong, rather than, oh, I can see why you would have thought that, but here's an element you're missing. Because you think about how a teacher in a classroom interacts with learners, a lot of their tone, a lot of their conversation is affirming the learner and then growing new skills. Whereas so often the tone of e-learning is very punitive. And so I recommend that you switch that up a bit. Think about being a coach, a mentor, more than a gatekeeper. So one thing I would really encourage you to do, and I call it listening to the voice of your training. That is, when you're writing your script or even getting your interactions done, get somebody to sit with you and read it, almost like reader's theater. One of you is the instructor, what's being said on the screens. The other is a learner creating the responses. And the process of you actually having that interaction will open your eyes, I think, to some of the absurd things that we create unwittingly. It's sort of like the things that you see on late night TV where they read mean tweets, things that seem okay when somebody wrote it. When you actually think about how that impacts a person who is reading it, it transforms it completely. And we have a little bit of that same problem in e-learning, that if you treat your learners as powerless and wanting to do the wrong thing and needing to be corralled in all the time, they're going to behave that way. If you treat learners much more as a person that you're there to help, that you believe in, you're going to get a very different sort of success. So try to be much more supportive and mentoring in the way that the content is written. So does context matter? It's a simple question, but I think one that we don't think of as much as we ought to. But if we look at examples that are where so often e-learning is created in a uniform, meaningless template, that would suggest that content doesn't matter. We just have to put the stuff out there and that the words will communicate everything they need to. Well, take a look at these different contexts for the exact same words. And I hope you see all of a sudden how words don't create meaning without context. This guy on the left, the sales commission is going to be 10%. That's a great thing, we know, because he's happy. Whereas the person in the middle, she's outraged. The sales commission is going to be 10%, and the person on the right is depressed. And all of those things, even the same words, create an entirely different meaning. And we create that possibility for misinterpretation because what makes sense seems perfectly clear to us when we write it. can be interpreted very differently by someone who is not as aware or up to date on the content. And so we need to use context to create meaning. So that's our principle. Don't rely just on words. You need to have context. It isn't just the content, it's how this is being used. The context adds meaning to interactions, and without the context, the significance of the content can be lost. And in particular, generic templates usually provide no meaningful context. And so either it's through storytelling, through imagery, through scenarios, all those things are ways that you can create contextual meaning around the content you're trying to communicate. We just have a couple more here. Our question, does it help your performance and confidence to have someone looking over your shoulder making comments as you try something new? Think about anything in your life when you're trying to learn something new and you've got somebody just monitoring your every move. How confident are you in performing? For me, and I think for many people, it actually gets in the way of trying things out that you might otherwise want to learn. Our principle here to support this idea is we just need to stop judging and scoring everything. Somehow, and this goes along with the idea that interactions are about testing when they're really about getting people to think. But I think we put so much stock in the structure that our LMSs create, and they are built in a way to expect a score. You need to send something back, what the learner did. Well, doing that puts this burden on the learner of knowing that someone's potentially looking at this, and I don't want to make an error if that will be interpreted as something that shows I'm confused, when in truth, the thing I need to do at this moment is try this thing. I know it's wrong, but I want to try it and see what happens, because that's going to confirm and teach me something important about this principle. So really, if you can just stop thinking about judging everything. What's typical in many of our lessons is there's a practice mode, which are interactions that the learner can do and explore, but it's simply not judging it. And then there's a literal switch, and then now when you're ready, we'll do a test. And that's when the scoring will take place. That freedom creates so much opportunity for learning. And so that's what this principle is trying to achieve, is allow learning to occur through exploration and making mistakes. I think there's a very strong case to be made that you can't learn if you don't make errors. Because that's when you reassess and bring in new information. And so if we are getting in the way of making mistakes, we're getting in the way of learning. And I think this is our last one. When you know someone will probably fix things you overlook. That is, if I don't do something too carefully, but somebody's there to fix it, does that make you work more carefully or less carefully? Generally, it makes us work less carefully. If we make a mistake and I know that it's going to be caught by someone else, then who cares? And so our principle here is you need to hold the learner accountable. Don't fix everything. Don't give the answer. If I make a mistake, don't immediately say, no, here's the answer. Say, that wasn't right. You want to try again and figure that out. Or here's a little bit more information that you maybe are missing. Can you put that together to come up with the right answer? And what that creates is an expectation of performance, that the learner knows that I've got to pay attention and do this because I'm going to be held accountable. I can't just rely on, if I just keep hitting anything, ultimately it's going to say, here's the answer, let's move on. And unfortunately, many, many learners come to your lessons with their top priority being to get done as quickly as possible. And when they are not held accountable, often the quickest way through is just guessing. And there's no benefit made in that sort of a learning environment. So help the learner understand the real life consequences encountered on the job, incorporate those into the So here we are, time for having another example. This one I want to really focus on all 10 principles. I know it's a lot to keep in mind, and so I encourage you to come back and think about these at lots of different examples. And if you download the ebook, which we'll have instructions for, it'll help you remember them. But what we're talking in is don't deliver so much content, let the learner do things. Make sure you're creating an end activity that is engaging and meaningful. Put the learner in control. Design gestures that feel like you're really doing something. Don't be adversarial in your training. Be much more supportive in terms of how you're giving the information they need. Create context. Don't rely on arbitrary statement of objectives. Don't judge everything immediately. Make it feel like you're doing something real, and hold people accountable. So again, those are our 10 principles, and I'm going to show you an example here that I think illustrates these really well. This is an example that was done for an organization called Operation Lifesaver, and it's a group that is funded through the railroad industry and also some money through the Department of Transportation that is dedicated to reducing fatalities around vehicle and train accidents. In school buses, you hear about this on the news. It's a terrible thing when a school bus is hit by a train. And so they wanted to provide some resources for many of the school bus drivers who come on service as a way to increase their performance. Again, you can imagine that there's a rules of the road book. We all have driver's license, and we've gone through those things, and we answer the questions, and yet there's an awful lot of wrecks on the road. So people are not performing in line with their knowledge. We can pass the test, and yet we're bad drivers. So this is trying to address that by not hiding behind the knowledge and instead creating learning that puts the learner at risk, puts them in control of doing the tasks involved in driving. So here we go. We're actually on a road. We're driving our school bus. You can see the different controls. As I approach, I see that there's a railroad crossing coming, and so I can do things like slow down. I can open up my windows. As I get closer, I see that there's a stop sign, so I'm going to go ahead and stop. I need to stop at the right distance. And then I don't hear anything. The window's down, so I'm going to go ahead and cross this railroad crossing. Now, as it turns out, there was no train, and so I actually crossed it safely.
When you've finished reviewing how you've done, click continue to advance to the next crossing.
There's some audio helping me understand that if you heard that noise in the background. But what's going on is I get a driver's report, and even though I successfully crossed that track, I didn't do everything I should have done. I didn't turn on the hazard lights. I didn't open the door. I didn't look both ways, and so forth. So, in real life, you can sometimes get by, but it's holding me accountable in that I'm not going to have a very good score at the end of this. I only got 40%. So I can go back and fix this, or I can continue down onto the next crossing. Hurry on, the kids are being a little rambunctious, and I've got the radio playing. I can change channels. Here comes a railroad crossing. I'm going to turn the radio off, and I'm going to use the intercom to get the kids to shut up. And in doing that, I was distracted, and something terrible happened. My bus crashed. Talk about consequences of not doing the right thing. It is so much more meaningful than you got 44%. I really failed. And so now I need to go back and do this same crossing. I need to get the kids to be quiet. So I need to turn off the radio. And here comes the railroad crossing. I'm going to slow down a little bit. I slowed down too soon. But I need to roll down the window. I'm going to stop. Oh, the train's coming. I'm going to I think I pulled way too far. The kids are talking again. I want to open the door. I want to roll down the windows. I want to look both ways. Well, there's a train going, so there's clearly a problem. I'm going to look both ways before I proceed. I didn't turn on the hazard. I want to make sure they're on. I'm ready to go, so I'm going to turn those off, close the door, roll my window back up, and cross the track. And the kids are getting worked up again.
You've completed this process. When you're finished reviewing your score, click Continue to complete the route.
Now I'm doing much better, but notice it's really holding me accountable because, you know, I stopped so far away and then I sped up that I did in the mind of the driver, and actually if a police person were watching this, it would appear that I sped up and just stopped rather than slowing down. I didn't turn on the hazard lights until after the train had already passed. And so I need to continue to do better. But I hope you can see how this design came almost entirely from implementing those practical principles and keeping those in mind. This has sort of had extraordinary impact in creating drivers that are so much more aware of the safety procedures and much more reliable in always executing the principles of safe crossing. Here's another example I want to share as we're going to wrap up here. This one was done for a shoe chain called Journeys, and this was particularly for their Journeys Kids shows. And they had stores, and they wanted to communicate in a way that was really engaging and, again, not so preachy to their young employees. And they had a very specific sales process that they knew worked, but they wanted to let the learner explore that and really get a good sense for how to be a successful salesperson. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that interactivity. We start with a goal. Through the course of the next activity, you're going to interact with 4 different customers. To hit your sales goals, you need to be sure to apply everything you've learned about the 6 selling steps and must-see behaviors. This, again, is sort of the final interaction, and there's stuff that led up to it, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you this last piece, but which is the first thing that was designed. So I have certain goals of what I need to sell this day, how many shoes, how many socks, and so forth. So their customers walk in the store, and the first thing is I have a few moments to make some observations. And if I pay attention to the person, it's going to help me in some of the choices I can make later in terms of building rapport. So here's this customer. I'm going to notice that there's the kid's got a cool t-shirt on. They've been shopping. He's got a bunch of shopping bags. And that's a father and son shopping together. So now I'm ready to greet the customer. And you only have like 20 seconds to make those observations. And we're going to pick how we're going to talk to this man and his son. So we haven't yet seen what shoe they're looking at, but he's saying, hey guys, I love your shirt. That's super cool. What kind of shoes are you looking for today? Or I can say, hello, sir, can I help you find anything today? Hey guys, I know you're doing what kind of shoes are you looking for? Or hi there, should I grab some shoes for your son to try on? Of course, this first one is the best. It sort of shows that you're paying attention, is engaging with the kid. So I'm going to say that. And the kid says, I don't know. And the dad says, hi, we're good, thanks. This guy's feet are growing fast. You know, this arrow on our accelerometer went up, and the coach is saying, great job greeting and acknowledging both of your customers. Parents always appreciate when you make their kids feel comfortable while still addressing their needs. So the content isn't so much lecturing, but it's presented as a coach that is supportive in these choices. I need to continue the conversation. We just got some new athletic shoes in, or you're looking a little dressier and so forth. Well, one of the things they want you to do is give what they call a tour of the store, which is what this conversation does. So The customer is thankful, and we find out he's looking for something with dressier clothes. They're looking at this sort of leather shoe that's sort of casual, but it's not a tennis shoe. And so I need to continue on here. I'm going to answer a few questions quickly because I want you to see the end of this lesson. Okay, now I think I know enough that I'm ready to go get some shoes. So we're going to measure his feet because he said that his feet are growing. We're really doing well on our celometer. And now I'm ready to go and get those shoes. So you sit tight and I'll be right back for that shoe for you to try on. And I'm going to go get shoes. And now they have this system where they want you to bring out 4 pairs of shoes actually, because they want you to sell multiple shoes. So I want to get the shoe that they're looking at. They want you to get a shoe that's a similar shoe, something that you think the kid might like. I'm going to give him a tennis shoe. And then they have what's called actually I have that wrong. I'm going to give him a tennis shoe here. And then what they call the designated second pair, which is shoes that they have on they have broken lots of and they want to try to sell. So there I'm going to present these shoes. Okay, someone made a mistake here. They don't like the shoes. That I'm going to get rid of this one and this one. I'll give a sandal and designated second pair. Shoot, this is a problem of talking while you're trying to demonstrate things. Well, I'm going to go back and I'll show you the slide. I think you can maybe look at this from our website. The thing that happens is later on when you finally get to present the shoes, instead of doing this as a just word-based multiple choice questions that are sort of easy to guess, what it does is it allows the learner to create sort of a graphic story, that my choices are panels in a cartoon, and I can say, here's another one, or just let the kid look at them or try to sell them. And as I do that, I create this panel that actually creates a storyline that you can back up and recreate and get a feeling for what would this sales interaction be like, rather than just answering static questions that are removed from the actual process. Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. It'll take too long to go back through those first things again, and I'm not sure what error made, which, by the way, is a really good aspect of e-learning, is if you can't just fake your way through. That means it's requiring thought. And in my talking at the same time of trying to answer questions, I obviously had done something that was not consistent with the best choice. So while it's a sad thing for our webinar right now, it actually is a great thing for e-learning, in that it makes sure the learner is being held accountable for the right process. Okay?
Thank you all for joining us today. And if you have any questions, please send me an email. Again, my name is Rich Peterson. You can send that to rpeterson@alleni.com, or visit the Allen Interactions website, www.alleninteractions.com. We do have the examples that Ethan shared with us on the site, or if you, again, send me an email, we'd be pleased to get in touch and talk to you. I believe that's all we have for today. Again, thank you for joining. And if you're visiting us this presentation on YouTube, there are other examples, video examples that you'll find on the Allen Interactions YouTube channel. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.